So the other day, I was driving past the student union, and I happened to see a gaggle of people in red cloaks gathered out in front. I was intrigued about what the purpose of this demonstration was, and knowing that the school has a Quidditch team, my first thought was it was some sort of nerdery. And it turns out I was right. It was some sort of nerdery. But it wasn't a Quidditch match, or some Spurgs playing dagger here. No, it was the local attempt at a Women's March protest, and the red cloaks were women dressed up as handmaids from the popular Handmaid's Tale television program, which depicts a dystopian future where right-wing authoritarians rule the world, and despite fertile women being arguably the most valuable asset on the planet, all decide to treat them like slaves and breeding sows? Because that didn't really totally think that plot point out, now did ya, Margaret Atwood? Anyway, given the Women's March Part 2 also occurred not too long ago, I was reminded of just how common this sort of public LARPing and association of fictional media with political statements seems to be, particularly as it's coming from the left. There have been countless pussy hat-clad women with signs about how Trump is Voldemort, and begging Dumbledore to save them, or how he's Sauron, or portraying their whiny little cry-ins as rebels versus the Empire, or representative of the characters in the Hunger Games, or even the Hill Dog herself comparing herself to Cersei Lannister, which is weird since yelling shame, shame, shame has apparently been a common theme across these protests, which in and of itself was kind of odd because that is what the extremist group in Game of Thrones does, and it's just never made a lot of sense to me as to why you would want to represent that group.
Shame, 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 shame.
Even my beloved Star Trek isn't safe. Although, hey, look here, buddy. The world that Star Trek promised you is a post-scarcity society, and as such, inherently not a socialist or communist one. Anyway, I found this all exceptionally interesting when I started to think, hey, why don't I see the same type of fictional character association coming from the right, at least not in the same degrees. Sure, the right has its fair share of LARPers, don't get me wrong, be it with We Was Vikings and shit, or the occasional Hugo Boss enthusiast, and really I can't blame you for that second one. But the political narratives of the right don't seem to be overly oriented around fictional narratives. And again, it's not like right-wingers have never used fictional narratives too. Here's a few examples. It just seems that one side is far more concerned with fictional narratives than the other, particularly when it comes to using fictional narratives in order to frame political ideas and political movements. And speaking as someone who's done far more than my fair share of cosplaying, I'm not intending to make any kind of necessary judgment statement here in the people who do this. I admit I think the behavior is really cringe-inducing, but again, right-wingers certainly can do some cringy stuff too. My question here was based around empirical observations. I see a trend about emulating fictional narratives in political discourse being prevalent across a certain group, and I ask myself, well, why might that be? Through the process of inductive reasoning, therefore, working from an observation, I set out to try and find some potential answers. Why does the left LARP as Harry Potter characters and the right LARP as Vikings? Thus today I want to talk about narratives, that is, stories. What makes them so persuasive to various people, and what personological factors affect this? And, finally, why might it be that we see this focus on fictional media more predominantly from left-leaning groups than from right-leaning groups, and what potential outcomes may it have on behavior and beliefs? My initial thought is that knowing that left-leaning people tend towards neuroticism and emotionality, particularly emotional instability, that there could be some important aspect of emotional identification with characters in fictional narratives involved in this phenomena. Thus, I want to begin by describing two traits: need for cognition and need for affect. Need for cognition is essentially enjoyment of thinking for thinking's sake, being curious. Interestingly, while there are some positive correlations between need for cognition and intelligence scores in the image shown here, this is on the IST-2000R intelligence instrument, need for cognition can be high or low in people of any level of intellect. It seems to describe, again, just a general sense of curiosity. By contrast, we have need for affect, which is enjoyment of feeling emotions for emotion's sake. These two constructs are not in any way mutually exclusive. In fact, they are often correlated with one another. That is, individuals who are high in need for cognition may also be high in need for affect. This may be because they both share strong correlations with one of the big five personality traits, that being openness to experience, as we can see here from IONS 2001 for need for affect, and then here in Fleischhauer et al. 2010. These are traits themselves, need for cognition and need for affect, which means further that with some rare exceptions, people are generally consistently high or low in either one of these aspects throughout the entirety of their lives. If you're high in need for affect now, you're likely always to be, and vice versa, or both or neither at the same time. Understanding need for cog and need for affect, then, let's discuss their relationship to individual political ideologies. Acrenu and van der Wiel in 2013 found that need for cognition was associated with more moderate changes in perception both of one's own political party and opposing political parties when faced with negative information about either party. Basically, people who are high in need for cognition think a little bit more about things, so they tend to be a bit slow on the uptake on any new bits of information, both regarding their own political beliefs and regarding the political beliefs of others. They're a little bit slower to take up new beliefs. In contrast, people who are high in need for affect, individuals who want to feel more, had much more pronounced responses to negative primes regarding not only their own party, but the opposite party. Of particular interest is that giving people who were high in need for affect a negative prime, a negative message about their own political party, well, that actually increased their positive associations of their own party. It created a type of boomerang effect, or psychological reactance, while a negative prime towards the opposing party elicited a much greater negative response towards that opposing party. In short, people who are high in need for cognition, they think a little bit more carefully before they change their minds, whereas people who are high in need for affect, they have a greater desire to want to protect their own and think well of their own, and also kind of a greater outgroup hatred. In other words, people who tend to desire more information, to think for thinking's sake, they change their attitudes regarding both their own and oppositional groups slightly over time when presented with negative information. But those who desire emotional interaction and emotional exposure were essentially more partisan, in that negative information only bolstered their own partisanship approval of their own political beliefs and positive opinions towards their in-group. In regards to approval of the opposing party, after reading a short prompt which portrayed that party in a negative manner, higher needs for affect generally decreased approval of the outgroup. However, this was not the case universally, as self-described Republicans in high affect cases actually slightly increased their approval of Democrats after reading the negative Democrat prime. These charts right here illustrate an interesting difference between Republicans and Democrat perceptions of the opposing party. Republican responses tended to vary greater in approval towards Democrats, despite a general trend of higher need for affect being associated with lower approval of the Democrats. But take note of the variance in the second response. The second prime actually forwarded a slight increase in the approval in those Republicans higher in need for affect, potentially illustrating an empathetic response towards the Democrats. In contrast, the basal approval of Republicans from Democrats was markedly lower at the outset, regardless of any individual differences. But the responses were also far more condensed and linear along a thin downward association between greater affect and lesser approval. While these data indicate that a need for affect and a need for cognition affect how one's attitudes towards both held political ideology and held political in-groups and the oppositional ideology and oppositional out-group, they also indicate a difference in the way that this information is processed between left and right-leaning individuals. In other words, we see a lot of variance in how Republicans or conservatives tend to respond to negative information about Democrats. But when it comes to Democrats, well, at least according to these data, it seems fairly negative, and it only gets worse the greater need for affect you possess. The explanation for these differences may be explained by Leone and Chirimbolo 2008, who found a positive correlation between need for cognition and conservatism. In contrast, the data indicated that conservative beliefs were related to emotional avoidance. That is, given that right-wing conservative beliefs are typified by preservation, often motivated out of fear of undesired social alteration or change, it may be thereby that conservatives are more likely to avoid overtly emotional situations or contexts, instead favoring a more cognitive or stringent approach to accepting new ideas. It makes sense from what we know about need for cognition, why this might be associated with conservatism. Not so much that conservatives are somehow more intelligent, but more that they want to think about things slowly and carefully before adopting new attitudes or beliefs. Knowing that conservatives are, conserving something, that's sort of just logical, is it not? It could also be that what Leone and Chirimbolo found from this avoidance of emotion has to do with how a lot of how conservatives think or feel when it comes to emotional response regards fear or disgust emotions that have been identified as the emotions commonly linked with conservatism, which again lines with the moral foundations model that indicates conservatives tend to value purity, as described by Graham Haidt and Nosek 2009. However, Tritt, Ishlet, and Peterson 2013 also identified that generalized, not just fear-based, but generalized emotional arousal may be associated with acceptance of conservative messages and belief in general, basically meaning that the more aroused you are emotionally, the more likely you are to accept certain conservative beliefs, which may indicate a reason for which people who consider themselves conservatives would want to avoid emotional context, because it kind of gets their blood boiling. They don't want to think about these things, because it is the basis of a lot of their beliefs. Further, Burton, Plax, and Peterson 2015 identified that conservatives tend to be lower in neuroticism than left-leaning participants, as I mentioned earlier, and given that neuroticism is associated with lower emotional stability, well, it makes sense again why conservatives might want to avoid overly emotional situations. Further, Carney, Jost, Gosling, and Potter 2008, in a meta-analysis of studies concerned with personality factors between liberals and conservatives, identified numerous traits or aspects that one could describe as non-emotional, cold, specifically aspects of self-control and restraint that were common among conservatives. These factors may all provide a partial explanation for the findings of Leone and Chiarambello in the tendency of conservatives to avoid emotional context, preferring instead more detached, slow, considerate thinking. This is in no way to say that more conservative individuals are not prone to emotions. In fact, it's probably why they tend to avoid them, were I to make a guess. Because the emotions most commonly affiliated with and associated with conservatism are those also affiliated with fear. In a now somewhat famous study, Holbrook et al. 2015 used transcranial magnet stimulation, that's essentially putting strong magnetic forces through the brain, fucking magnets, how do they work, directed at areas of the brain known to forward reduction in neural activity when subjected to this type of TMS stimulation, and found that those who were exposed to said stimulation reported more positive appraisals of immigrants, both those who expressed anti-US sentiments and pro-US sentiments, as well as lesser belief in God or spiritual concepts such as ghosts. Now, I say this study is infamous because the obvious joke is that leftist politics can essentially be induced with minor brain damage, which is hilarious, but slightly inaccurate. More accurately, it's likely that this stimulation disables part of the brain that processes fear, because a lot of these responses, they're fear-based responses. Related research from Napier, Huang, Von Schack, and Barg 2017, in what I consider a horribly operationalized study, I mean, really, this is some abysmal shit if you know what you're talking about, found that when conservatives imagined a scenario where they were invulnerable to harm, they expressed fewer conservative views than when they imagined a scenario where they were given a different superpower, namely flight. Now, asking people to imagine the impossible, these impossible scenarios, that's outright poor methodology. But in the context, we can start to see a general trend in conservative traits. That is, right-leaning politics are in part related to aroused emotions, particularly those of fear, and that it seems to elicit a desire to avoid overly emotional situations, and perhaps a tend towards need for cognition as a result, to avoid emotional context, because the strongest emotions that are probably going to be aroused are fear emotions. You might ask then, well, if conservatives are operating entirely out of fear, they must be very emotionally charged, right? How can this be then that they're opting more towards need for cognition and not need for affect? Well, no, that also doesn't appear to be the case. For example, King and Maruna 2009 found that previous victimization, that is actually having been the victim of a violent crime, was a poor predictor of conservative attitudes towards punitive action compared to, for example, concerns with future generations and the economy. Is this kind of starting to make some sort of sense? In that, fear or arousal does seem to typify right-wing political beliefs, but those beliefs are not necessarily out of a place of personal fear, but actually quite rational fear. Fears about the future, fears about the economy, not fears about being personally attacked. Again, supporting the idea that despite the seemingly emotionally charged nature of many right-wing politics that we often see described, right-wingers' emotional responses don't really come from a place of victimization and irrationality, but rather potentially from elaboration, from slowing down, stopping, and thinking about what they believe. Again, you can very much disagree with the conclusions of those elaborations, absolutely you can, for you could find them completely incorrect, but it seems to be fairly consistent in the set of traits that define those who lean farther to the right, lean not only more towards a need for cognition, but also lean away from a need for affect, and engage in forms of emotional avoidance. Once again, I need make clear that need for cognition is not strongly related to intelligence, but rather is a trait possessed by some individuals who just tend to enjoy thinking more for thinking's sake, or maybe just want to elaborate upon things a bit more thoroughly. And although there is considerable overlap with need for affect, this may help explain the disparate findings between Republicans and Democrats that we found in Ochranu and van der Wielen. If conservatism is correlated to need for cognition, which we found above, then that could explicate the wider variance in attitudinal change for persuasive outgroup messages, including even the slight positive increase in attitudes under some circumstances. And as always, these are only averages and aggregates. They never refer to any one individual, just as need for cognition and need for affect are traits that don't preclude one's intelligence. These are just general findings. But what is the point of all of this need for affect, emotional versus cognitive shit, Aiden, and what does it have to do with narratives of lefties playing Hogwarts? Well, let me introduce you to narrative transportation theory. I've mentioned it on a number of occasions, but this time we're going to dig real deep into this shit. We're going to be transported into it, you could say. Narrative transportation is the process through which an individual is transported into a media narrative. You can see Green and Brock 2000 for the seminal on that. That is, to be transported is to feel as though one is inside a piece of media, becoming distanced from reality. To be transported into a piece of media means to feel as though you are in a sense part of the narrative, you are part of the story. Surely many of you have experienced this phenomenon, but to clarify, to be transported is a state wherein, according to Garrick and Prentice 1991, quote, the traveler is transported by some means of transportation as a result of performing certain actions. The traveler goes some distance from his or her world of origin, which makes some aspects of the world of origin inaccessible. The traveler then returns to the world of origin somewhat changed by the journey. You've ever read a book or watched a movie and you can almost feel like you can perceive the sensory perceptions of that world that you're inhabiting and experiencing? The sights, the sounds, for better or worse, the smells? That's what it means to be truly transported. Interestingly, the research is still a bit up on the air about what type of media best lends itself to this type of personological involvement. Chaikin and Eagley, 1983, found that participants were more persuaded into attitude change by non-regulated media, that is film and television that they could not pause, than written works that they could read and reread or cover slowly with care and consideration. However, Green and Brock 2002 found greater feelings of transportation in multimodal media rather than pure text. Potential for individual differences in traits, particularly in transportability, also exist, as we will cover in detail. Regardless, it seems narratives of any format can pull us into their worlds, under a certain set of circumstances. Narratives differ from other types of text or media in that they have the unique ability to draw one in this way. That is, no matter how enraged I may get while watching the jokers on CNN peddle their drivel, thank Odin I never feel as if I'm in the studio sniffing Dawn's lemony scent. Media that are not narrative in nature, outside of some rare examples like highly compelling speeches or moving narration, are unlikely to turn us into travelers and transport us into their world, likely because we recognize on some level that these media, what are called rhetorical media or rhetorical messages, are still somewhat based in our reality, rather than a place to which we might venture for the purpose of pure entertainment or enjoy. Okay, but again, what does this have to do with anything? Well, quite a lot when it comes to politics, education, public health, and etc., as narratives and education, particularly entertainment media, may be used to convey persuasive messages, and have been used to potentially alter human behavior. Let me give you kind of a counterexample before we start. Ever watch those really spooky anti-smoking advertisements that are clearly designed to scare you shitless?
The committee has reached the overall judgment that cigarette smoking is a health hazard of sufficient importance to the United States to warrant remedial action. In view of the continuing and mounting evidence from many sources, it is a judgment of the committee that cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate.
You can quit. For free help, visit cdc.gov/tips.
Well, when you scare someone like that, it evokes a sense of what's called mortality salience, and that is thinking about death. And a common way of reacting to those kinds of messages is to essentially tune them out, to stick one's fingers in one's ears, because the message reminds us of the inevitability of our own timely demise. Hey, don't turn off the video yet! Didn't mean to activate your mortality salience. But narratives that include persuasive messages, persuasive narrative messages, rather than just trying to scare the shit out of you, now those carry some weight, given that they are intended to draw the viewer into a story or world. Many public health campaigns involving edutainment programs, that is, entertainment for the purpose of education, including narratives that contain a persuasive message, have been successful in increasing, for example, contraceptive use across many rural and impoverished nations. While public health campaigns can be effective without narratives, as Kincaid 2000 found in his longitudinal analysis of contraception use, intent, and behavior, resulting in a 2.1 increase in overall usage over the course of 6 months in the Philippines, narratives may be even more persuasive to enact change than merely public health notices. For example, Sud Sengupta, Raj Mishra, and Jacobi, 2004, and this is only one, there are so many of these examples, but this is just one that I read most recently, found that Nepalese people who listened to narrative story programs were more likely to be both aware of the various forms of contraception available to them, and also to plan or utilize them, after listening to a radio program about it. A radio program with a narrative. That isn't just someone came onto the radio and said, hey, use contraceptives. No, it was actually like a soap opera that told a story. This effect was particularly salient in the condition where participants listened to this program as a group, and then likely discussed it with each other afterwards, highlighting, in this instance and in many instances, the importance of post-mediated exposure communication in persuasion effects, but that's a whole nother can of beans. Thus we must ask, why are narratives in general so much more persuasive than just mere rhetorical messages? Given that the transported person is highly engaged with the narrative, they may be unable to process any contrary or contradictory information to the persuasive message, as suggested by the Extended Elaboration Likelihood Model in Slater and Rohner 2002. The EELM expands upon the ELM by including narratives into how we process information, and I'll get into what all of this means. Basically, the ELM, the Elaboration Likelihood Model, states that we have two general methods of processing information, central and peripheral, basically message or flair. But the EELM, the extended model, includes the additional factor of narratives by assessing degrees of character identification, overall media enjoyment, and involvement with the narrative. In other words, you're kind of unlikely to be persuaded by messages in a narrative that you find boring, or where you hate all the characters, or that you find just distasteful or outright poor in quality. Although on some level, as receivers, we know that these narratives, that these stories are fake or fictional. The fictional nature of the narrative does not affect transportation. Transportation is dependent on two types of realism. Narrative realism, that is, how internally consistent is the message with its own story and plot and world, and external realism for the individual story, in that how much does it have to do with things that we know in reality. You can see Brussel and Bill Zandik, 2009, for that. But as such, narratives need not be real to be perceived as real. Thus, messages received through a narrative may be persuasive in affecting behavioral change, or at least attitudinal change, regardless of how incredibly fictive they are. If anything, as stated above, the lack of realism may even assist in the act of transportation. To clarify how this process all works cognitively, the Elaboration Likelihood Model, as I mentioned above, posits that individuals process information in two distinct ways at any given time, centrally or peripherally. The seminal on that is Petty and Cacioppo, 1996. Central processing involves careful consideration of a message, while peripheral processing involves attention to cues outside of the central message. When messages are processed peripherally, the persuasive intent is often not processed, or perceived of at all. Thus, messages intended to be persuasive may not be perceived of as such, if the message is being processed peripherally, as might be the case in many forms of media. This does in some ways go back to need for cognition versus need for affect. Now, it's not that same way all the time. There are times where we're distracted, which is kind of what we're getting into. But generally speaking, people who are higher in need for cognition might be also more likely to engage in central route processing based on a number of other factors. Slater and Rohner 2002 presented the extended ELM, which I described earlier, which includes two additional factors in the model to predict the effectiveness of persuasive messages in narrative transportation, absorption and identification with the characters in a narrative. Absorption refers to transportation into the narrative, the extent to which the perceiver feels that he or she is actually transported into the story. Thus, the EELM predicts that the more absorbed a perceiver is into the narrative, the less likely they will be able to engage in what's called counter-arguing. That is, to argue against a persuasive message being given within the narrative structure. Identification, in the definition of Slater and Rohner, is the extent to which a perceiver feels as though he or she would like to become friends with another character or to be a character. Identification affects persuasion in that the more perceivers like a character, the more they will likely be sympathetic towards them. And again, because they like the character so much, rather than critically considering any persuasive messages, will likely go along with whatever the character believes or does, and perceive that as correct or the right course of action. You can see Graff, Hogan, Sanders, and B&T's 2015. That is, in short, likable characters are more persuasive at selling a given message, and the more absorbed that we are into a story, the more transported we are. Similarly, the more likely we are to be persuaded without even realizing that we're being persuaded. The power of transportation on persuasion then is that, when transported, individuals are incapable of making counter-arguments to persuasive messages encountered, if they're able to even perceive of the existence of a persuasive message present in the media at all. Character identification and absorption into stories may make it difficult for one to even notice any persuasive message in the first place, like I said. And if it is noticed, the same mechanisms of transportation will prevent your brain from thinking too heavily about it, and thus prevent counter-arguing. Essentially, when we are transported, our minds and all of our cognitive resources are wound up in processing the narrative that we're enjoying, the characters, the environment that we find ourselves in. Normally, we would be able to form counter-arguments to ideas or concepts that fall outside of our accepted latitudes of belief, but when transported, we lack the mental collateral to fully and totally process these persuasive messages centrally. We are engaged in peripheral route processing. Transportation requires that we enjoy the media on some level, and thus these effects are limited to that which we enjoy. There are also considerations involving, as I mentioned, need for cognition, but we will get more into that. According to social judgment theory, though, and that's Hovland and Sharif 1980 as the seminal, we have latitudes of acceptance, rejection, and non-committance in regard to any topic on which we hold an opinion, and might be willing to shift said opinion. Typically, we will only be persuaded by arguments that are very similar to what we already hold. Now, some of us have greater or wider latitudes of acceptance, and some of us have thinner on any given topic. But within that latitude of acceptance, when we are transported, our normal thinking selves are distracted by the kind of intense processing that we are engaged in with the media, and thus, our normal latitudes of acceptance are widened. The transported state of the receiver allows for this type of inoculation against not only counter-arguing, but even awareness that persuasive messages are being administered at all in a sort of variant of the Mark Antony gambit. That is, when addressing the Roman people after the death of Caesar, Antony states, "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him," and then proceeds to laud the shit out of him, extensively, allowing for the true message of Antony to remain obfuscated to the untrained listener. Instead, they just hear what he said he was going to say, because they're not expecting that type of persuasive message. You can see Danson, Zana, and Fong for more overview. Despite the many applications and potential uses of narrative transportation in the study of persuasion, a primary obstacle in the current literature is the validity of the narrative transportation scale as developed by Green and Brock in 2000. I have mentioned this several times as how not to develop a social science instrument. While transportation is defined as feeling being taken away from the real world and supplanted into the world of a fictional or imagined narrative, the instrument itself includes several questions that do not accurately assess that concept. It's possible instead that the current transportation instrument measures, instead, a related but dissimilar construct such as media enjoyment. And so yes, a new instrument probably does need to be devised. As it stands, items on the instrument mostly assess how much a participant seems to enjoy a piece of media, which should be conceptually distinct from feelings of transportation. There is also, however, this measure of transportability, which is how much an individual tends to feel transported into various media as a trait rather than a state. That is, well, sometimes any individual piece of media can suck any single one of us into its narrative. Some people are just more prone to being transported all the time into pretty much all media, and this is a very, very important thing to note as we go forward. Transportability is a trait, while to be transported is a state. Some people are just very, very high in transportability. Keep this in mind again as we go forward. As a bit of an aside though, and mostly just because I think it's neat, a relatively novel area of research in narrative transportation and persuasive messages is in the area of interactive narratives. Green and Jenkins 2014 state that video games, unlike traditionally non-interactive narratives such as books and television, provide a unique type of interactivity. That is because video games allow for digital body embodiment, the inhabiting of the body of a character in a virtual environment. The likelihood to be persuaded by narratives in these structures is potentially compounded. As I mentioned earlier, you have to like a character, you have to identify as them, you have to feel absorbed in media to be really transported, and what does that potentially more fully than video games? Further, it is possible that not identifying with the protagonist is equally complex and distinct, yet doesn't draw a person out of the transported state. It is very possible to not identify with the main character, but to also be highly transported into a narrative world. I'm reminded, for example, of something like Game of Thrones, wherein most of the characters are highly flawed and outright unlikable, yet this doesn't seem to prevent viewers from being very highly involved and absorbed in the story, and therefore experiencing the effects of transportation. Identification with media figures, though, is a term that has been sort of spuriously defined in various ways, including homophily and liking of a character, again see Slater and Rauner. So to avoid some of this confusion, I'm going to use a singular definition of identification in this particular review, and that is identification is feeling as if one embodies the media character and in essence becomes them. As such, identification is to feel as if one is physically merged with the media character. Methods of accomplishing this type of relationship can include first-person text, or a first-person visual perspective. Given that identification requires the reader or viewer place themselves in the shoes of a media figure, it does require some extent of transportation into the media narrative in and of itself, because you have to feel as though you're in the character's shoes. I should make clear that identification is distinct from parasocial interactions or relationships, in that the embodied perceiver cannot really have an interaction or relationship with oneself. Similarly, identification is distinct from wishful identification, as one cannot wish to be oneself. Thus, in contrast, wishful identification is identification with a character that one wants to be. That is, the viewer perceives a media figure as a positive potential self that he or she wishes to embody, to be. That is, oftentimes we don't see ourselves as a media figure in a media narrative, but see a character that we want to emulate. Unlike identification, wherein the viewer perceives him or herself in the place of the figure, wishful identification involves the desire to recreate the behaviors enacted by that character, or the desire to take on the roles or life of that figure. Social cognitive theory may help to explain wishful identification in that positive media characters may be modeled by those who like them. Social cognitive theory is a theoretical framework commonly used to explicate the potential for media exposure to affect viewers' proclivities and enact both positive and negative behaviors. See Nobby and Clark, 2008. According to social cognitive theory, individuals learn to engage in behaviors through modeling of behaviors they see enacted usually by a positive role model. The initial seminal is Holt and Brown, 1931. Again, unlike parasocial interaction or relationships, wishful identification does not involve interaction with the media figure, only a desire to emulate them. Characters who are portrayed as having various likable attributes thus may be more subject to potential wishful identification from viewers or perceivers. However, perceived similarity or homophily with the media character can also be associated with feelings of identification or wishful identification. See Hoffner and Buchanan, 2005. That is, we identify more with characters that have positive traits and are thereby more likely to be transported into these instances of identification, but are also more likely to identify with characters who we share perceived similarity with us. Thus, males tend to identify with highly successful, intelligent, and often violent male media figures, while women tend to identify with highly successful and beautiful female figures, who are admired by others in the character universe. Identification is not the only way we can know characters, though, not just by embodying them or wishing that we could embody them. We can also come to know characters as friends. All of this affects narrative transportation. Now, I've spoken quite a lot about parasocial interaction, so I'm not going to go over PSIs and PSRs too much in this video, but it is important that I do a really quick little rundown on them, right? A parasocial interaction is an individual instance of feeling as though one is engaging at an interpersonal type level with a media figure. The seminal is Horton and Wool, 1956. This comes about because psychologically we have difficulty distinguishing between the media portrayal of a person and a physical person in terms of how we respond to them. There are plenty of ways to induce a parasocial interaction. For example, breaking the fourth wall and having a character speak directly to the audience, having the camera face the media figure directly, as though the figure is placed in front of the viewer. All of this can elicit a single parasocial interaction, but it takes usually numerous parasocial interactions to result in a parasocial relationship, which is an extension, the long-term, usually unidirectional, pseudo-interpersonal relationships formed between an individual and a media character or figure. Unlike a single PSI, which happens in the moment, parasocial relationships can be maintained similarly to other types of interpersonal relationships. See Eon and Daly, 2012. Furr 1996 further lists several elements that are involved in relationship formation with media figures, such as proximity, attraction, similarity, and frequency of contact. Basically, I think most of you guys know this at this point, but if you interact with media figures enough, you come to feel as if you know them as real people. And possessing a strong parasocial relationship with a media figure, even if one does not highly identify with him, can cause increased transportability, because you are thinking about a friend. What's the point in all of this now? Well, as I described, when people are transported, they lack the cognitive capital to engage in counter-arguing, and given their distraction are susceptible to persuasive messages without even recognizing that they're being persuaded. This is important because it means media can change our minds, but it does so under various circumstances, and this form of persuasion requires the receiver be transported, which either results from many of the individual aspects described above, from identification or wishful identification or parasocial relationships, from being absorbed in the media, or simply from higher general transportability as a trait. Thus, those who are most susceptible to persuasive messages from media are those who are generally highest in transportability, or those who probably just consume a lot more narrative media. And that's where I've been driving this whole ship. Who is most likely to be persuaded by narrative messages, and therefore use narratives as a framework for the sense of the self, including one's own political ideology? First, let's discuss the effects of persuasive messages and their relationship with transportability as a trait. Mazzocco, Green, Satosa, and Jones, 2010, found that individuals who possessed high trait transportability were far more likely to be persuaded by narrative messages intended to increase positive attitudes toward homosexuals than by rhetorical messages. You can see this graph right here for an example. Again, rhetorical messages are statements that do not tell a story, but rather present arguments as statements of fact. In contrast, individuals low in transportability were more persuaded by rhetorical messages than by narrative ones, although they were generally less persuaded from either form of message. Just to state again, people who are high in transportability are very susceptible to attitude changes by narrative persuasion. Further, Apple and Richter 2010 identified an important moderator variable in whether or not one is going to feel transported, and that, my friends, is need for affect. Again, the desire to feel emotions for emotion's sake. Now, we've already established that conservatives tend to be lower in need for affect. In fact, they avoid emotional contacts. But let's also examine some of the general personality traits associated with need for affect in contrast, and compare personality traits associated with the two general political ideologies and need for affect, given that we can now see here that need for affect is an important factor in being transported. Thus, here are some other elements related to need for affect as identified by Maio and Isas 2001. Some factors negatively correlated to need for affect are generally negative affect, ambivalence of emotional expression, various forms of alexithymia, which is difficulty describing or expressing one's emotions, and note the way this is coded that the presence of the alexithymic traits is actually what was negatively correlated to need for affect. It's also negatively correlated to need for closure, need for structure, and interestingly, neuroticism. Then let's go and compare these things regarding need for affect to the big five personality traits and concepts identified among self-described conservatives and Carney et al. Closed-mindedness, restraint, cold, non-emotiveness, organized, self-controlled, all traits associated with the big five personality traits being high in conscientiousness, mixed on agreeableness, and low in openness to experience. Going back to our need for affect measure, here we can see positive correlations between the trait and other factors, such as seeking action, sensation seeking, that is desiring to try new things. All things positively correlated to the big five traits of agreeableness, openness, and extroversion. Flipping back over again to the big five analysis between political ideologies and Carney, and what do we see on the left-hand side? Sensation seeking, impulse, expressiveness, etc. Again, all things positively associated specifically with the traits of extroversion and openness to experience. I should point out again, though, here, that openness to experience and sensation seeking are also positively correlated to need for cognition, just as similarly, neuroticism is negatively correlated to both need for cognition and need for affect. But this may be, again, why we see further correlation between need for affect and need for cog, because they are highly related concepts. But I think I am describing here a fairly consistent difference between people who perceive themselves as liberal and people who perceive themselves as conservative, and what kind of traits might describe the person who is high in need for affect. Again, while these are just general personality traits describing averages across the population, it seems to make sense that individuals high in openness to experiences are more likely to be left-leaning politically. and also more likely to be high in need for affect, based on what I've just described above. Two things to point out here, though, however. First, again, that need for affect does not preclude a need for cognition. In fact, these data indicate, again, a positive correlation between the two, but also that neuroticism, a trait that I kind of originally thought of here, mildly associated with left-leaning ideology and emotional instability, was negatively associated both with need for affect and for need for cognition. Again, illustrating how these are merely shared common traits and are in no way determinant of any one individual. We could surmise that left-leaning people higher in neuroticism therefore may be less prone to need for affect and more immune thereby to being highly transportable, for example. Similarly, we could surmise that there is potentially some yet other unidentified mediating factor beyond what has been predominantly assessed here in this video with various personality traits that describes why conservatives lean toward need for cognition, despite the fact that it has a close association with openness of experience, which is negatively correlated with conservative political beliefs, generally speaking, given that conservatives also report having been typically raised under more authoritative parental styles. Childhood development may play a role in this potential model. Basically, what I'm saying is there's a lot left unexplained in this, explanation. But here's what I think we see. My question at the outset was, why do we see so common in the left the use of fictional narratives to frame political thoughts and beliefs? And I think I may have located a potential answer here. Narrative, transportation, and persuasion. Given this web of correlations I presented to you over this long video, we can see that left-leaning political ideology and a need for affect are correlated to big five personality traits like need for openness and extroversion. Of course, this is absolutely not causal data, so determining which came first in the model is impossible from the weaving I'm doing just here. These are simply correlations. We then know that people who are high in need for affect are more transportable, and the more transportable one is, the greater media narratives affect attitude changes through persuasive messages, as we've covered above. Thus, it's not really a surprise then that fictive stories that contain a progressive or left-leaning message are so powerful to people who kind of already lean that way. They're likely already falling within a latitude of accepted beliefs, of the people most susceptible to the types of persuasive messages being disseminated, meaning that if you already kind of lean left, as you may if you are high in need for affect, then not only are you more likely to be transported, but any left-leaning political messages that are disseminated through that narrative persuasion are even more likely to be persuasive as they aren't so far outside of the potential latitude of acceptance that you might possess in the first place. Meaning that over time, these messages can also be compounded. You can move people further and further left, or in whatever direction, but it looks like left here, through continual exposure to further and further left-leaning media messages that widen that latitude of acceptance. And the problem is that it's true. Our real-world beliefs can and are potentially affected by exposure to these persuasive media messages. Apple and Richter 2007 found that there was substantial change in beliefs immediately after exposure to persuasive media narratives, but that this waned over time. The question then is, when exposure to media narratives is nigh constant, and when the persuasive messages included in those media are consistent, can such an effect ever properly wean or wear off? Would it not then potentially cause long-term belief and ultimately behavioral change, given that we've seen the persuasive power in, for example, health messages in many countries? It seems to me that an inundation of these fictive persuasive messages means that a change in belief, and then potentially behavior, is likely to become ingrained through exposure to these messages. It certainly does seem to have that desired effect after all, as Vasali et al. 2015 identified readers and watchers of Harry Potter books and films expressed greater liking towards homosexuals and immigrants, and greater perspective taking towards refugees, particularly when they personally identified with the character of Harry Potter. I'm sure those unsurprising findings must have delighted J.K. Rowling from her 40-some empty bedroom refugee-less mansion, although, who knows, it's not like she's ever made her politics overwhelmingly evident or anything. But she's also certainly not alone in that, now is she? George Lucas also claimed he intended on some level for Star Wars to be a warning against fascism, stating in 2005 that A New Hope was, quote, really about the Vietnam War, and that period where Nixon was trying to run for a second term, which got me thinking historically about how do democracies get turned into dictatorships, because democracies aren't overthrown, they are given away. Gee, where have we seen some of that shit before, at least in the common narrative regurgitation? And more than ever, it seems in today's media climate, it really is difficult to escape the political messages seemingly more and more evident in every single piece of narrative fiction. From The Last Jedi being lambasted by fans even more so than its predecessor for being a weak framework upon which to hang a social justice message, to the popularity of shows like The Handmaid's Tale that tell a warning story of how women will become breeding slaves if we don't overthrow this horrible fascist government under Trump, to the inclusion of jabs about Trump in seemingly every single fucking program on television. From The X-Files,
"We are building a wall. It will be a beautiful, albeit invisible, electromagnetic wall that will subatomically incinerate any probes you attempt to send beyond your solar system. You're free to explore Uranus all you want, but we can't allow your kind to infiltrate the rest of the cosmos. You're not sending us your best people. You're bringing drugs. You're bringing crime. You're rapists."
to goddamn Doctor Who. You're not even in the US, for fuck's sake.
Like sewage and smartphones and Donald Trump, some things are just inevitable.
Doctor.
To just the overwhelming use of fictional narratives and characters to seemingly replace actual political consideration, all while being real fired up about politics, strangely enough. Now, as I said in the beginning, it's not like right-wingers don't do this too. They just do it a bit differently as far as I can tell. And again, as always, I'm only describing trends here, trends that I have witnessed and then inductively have worked towards finding an explanation for behavior from that empirical evidence. What I see right-leaning people do, in parallel to the left, adopting fictive narrative concepts and constructs, is to adopt the trappings and symbols and slogans of historical or political social movements. Be this in shouting Deus Vult, or LARPing as Viking pagans such as myself, or to this guy, being the rare suspicious dude out there with a Reichskrieg flag at Charlottesville. All of the role-playing and adoption of these sort of surrogates to represent ideology are based on the right on history, on reality in some sort of way, it seems. They are based not on narratives, but on rhetoric. And as we saw earlier, what did Mazzocco et al. 2010 find was more persuasive to people who are low in need for affect, as we know conservatives are? Well, it was rhetorical statements and information, not narratives. As we've seen, conservatives are less persuadable in general, and that's not because they're incapable of being persuaded, but because they sit and think about things longer, because they tend to avoid emotional over-arousal. And that seems to again be related to need for cognition over need for affect. But it does seem, if anything is persuasive to conservatives, it's rhetorical messages. What the hell does all of this mean, though, Aiden? What's the point of this? Well, I hope I've illustrated how narratives can change political beliefs or beliefs of any kind. Well, this can have major repercussions in terms of social movements, as we can see. As we can see people out in the streets with all of their signs about Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. It can also have very dangerous ramifications, I think, at least potentially. For example, we have a lot of people here who identify with the heroes of narratives and are persuaded by these messages of those narratives to fight back, quote unquote, against what they perceive of as an evil empire or regime under these narrative structures. Therefore, is it any wonder when we see people driven to violent action considering themselves through identification, or wishful identification, or parasocial relationships, either the hero or friends of the hero, or wanting to be the hero, such as the shooting of Steve Scalise, or now the suspicious envelope full of white powder that was sent to Trump's daughter-in-law Vanessa. Is it any real wonder that we see this? These are acts of desperation from likely very desperate individuals. And it is possible, I would say, that prolonged and excessive media exposure could affect highly transportable people to feel as though they have no other option than to rebel against the perceived evil empire with violence. They see violence under this fictive narrative, thus, I can imagine why they think violence is the only possible outcome. As always, media effects tend to be small, but they can compound. I'm not saying media causes violence, not in any real direct way. Merely it is possible for it to play a role in long-term, longitudinal attitude change. And long-term attitude change can actually alter behavior, as we've seen in public health campaigns. Finally, be aware before I close this, that you're never going to change or really persuade any partisans of any sort on any topic related to their partisanship. People who are already partisans, it doesn't matter how tiny and close you get to their latitude of acceptance, it's going to be very hard to move them. In an excellent book that I've mentioned several times before, The Political Brain, Drew Weston, 2008, who worked as a political advisor on the Obama campaign, illustrates thoroughly how aiming to appeal to those who have already made up their minds is essentially a waste of resources. When faced with discomforting information about their affiliated political party, as we've seen today, partisans quickly dismiss information and actually feel better about their political party. See Acrano and von der Weel in 2013 again. Particularly, this affects partisans high in need for affect. Who have we seen appears to be high in need for affect? The implications of these findings illustrate the persistence of partisanship, potentially particularly for the left, given what we've discussed today, but certainly is evident across all political sides, and as always, friends, describes only aggregates, not individuals. Here's the quick and dirty, the TLDR. What we've seen today seems to illustrate or indicate that left-leaning individuals may be more prone towards high need for affect. People who are higher in need for affect tend to be more transportable. People who are more transportable are more easily persuaded to attitude change through narrative messages, through fictive messages. In contrast, it seems that people who lean more conservative tend to be more affected, although considerably less in general, by rhetorical messages. So, that's it. I started all of this out by groaning at the sight of 30-odd people dressed in cloaks in front of the local student union in January. Much to my chagrin, not out to engage in the kind of live-action role-playing I might actually enjoy, but rather to protest Trump over what I consider to be very silly claims of enslaving women as broodmares. And of course, I fully support their right to protest, absolutely 100%. But, in contrast, I am also fully allowed to consider that to be cringy as all fuck. So after this very long spiel and this in-depth look at some communication research many of you may have never heard of before, I hope I have provided at least some potential answers as to why everybody LARPs. Even if just a little, everybody LARPs. But we all LARP for very different reasons and based on very different things. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt. Hey, see, that was some LARPing right there, Altana Volt, get it?